So our focus, our verse for today is actually just verse 10. That's the verse we're going to read. We're not going to read the whole 13 verses, but if you have your Bibles or the YouVersion app or however you read the Bible on your phone, iPad, or Bible with you, you can open up to there. But our focus will be verse 10, and I want to suggest right from the start that this verse is a warning for us about discontentment. This is where we're going to live today a little bit, about discontentment. And the goal for us, and I hope we note this goal, is that Apostle Paul is warning about discontentment and encouraging the church to move from discontentment to joy. All right, let's read verse 10. Apostle Paul, in his warnings, now starts, "And don't grumble, as some of them," Israelites, "did, and then were destroyed by the angel of death." Movement to joy, hey? Yeah, it's a little confusing. And what we have seen each week is that the Apostle Paul, as he warns the church, he's doing it in light of the Israel story. So this verse 2, this verse about grumbling and the angel of death, this confusing verse, is actually found out of the book of Numbers, chapter 21, where we would read, "Then the people of Israel set out from Mount Hor, taking the road to the Red Sea to go around the land of Edom. But the people grew impatient with a long journey, and they began to speak against God and Moses. 'Why have you brought us out of Egypt? To die here in the wilderness?' they complained. 'There's nothing to eat here and nothing to drink, and we hate this horrible manna.'" Notice the common experience in the wilderness, the movement into discontentment, the movement into disappointment when things don't go as we wish. In the wilderness, in the seasons of distress, we may feel discouraged, frustrated, irritated, angry, depressed, and at times it just feels like, I just got to throw in the towel. I've had enough. And so in the midst of this trouble and distress in the wilderness that we've been saying that God actually is calling us into, Apostle Paul warns us that when we are called into this wilderness, he says to us, don't grumble, as some of them did, and then we're destroyed by the angel of death. What I want us to notice here is the real issue, which isn't complaining. No, the real issue of grumbling is actually rooted in how we understand our relationship with God. Let's check the Numbers story that Apostle Paul is using as a juxtaposition again. "But the people grew impatient with the long journey, and they began to speak against God and Moses." God and Moses, who led them, provided for them, gave them the necessities. So what we need to see here is the problem of grumbling and complaining is actually rooted, again, in our impatience, and more specifically, rooted in our relationship with God. And this discontent in our relationship fosters a way of being, fosters a way of living, a way which is just not able to see or to receive how God is loving us or how God is leading us. In our impatience and grumbling, we begin to believe that we are not happy. And that means if we're not happy, that means God is absent. And so we begin to grumble more and more, and our discontent grows bigger and bigger, and our relationship begins to fracture more and more. And so then, in our discontent, we impatiently try to solve and fix and manage a culture focused and obsessed with the pursuit of happiness. And this pursuit of happiness becomes our focus and motivation instead of our pursuit of joy. See, pursuit of happiness is a fleeting emotion. I'm not saying you can't be happy. Of course, happiness is good. Happiness is maybe a byproduct of joy. But happiness in itself is just a feeling, and it's a fleeting feeling which leads us to resent suffering of any kind when it goes away. Why should I have to suffer this way? C.S. Lewis, the great thinker, theologian, apologist, writer, put it this way: the idea of joy is not a satisfied desire, but an unsatisfied desire, a deep longing for God, a hungry pursuit of God's heart that never ends and is more satisfying than any earthly happiness. An impatient heart with God confuses joy for happiness. And when the emotion fades, we are tempted to grumble, be impatient, and instead of trusting that God is near us. We then, in response, begin to look for ways to acquire satisfaction, to get happiness, rather than to trust God and learn to see and receive his leading. Now, Paula Darcy is a writer. Maybe she's not that well known, but she's a writer, speaker, and a therapist, and stated beautifully like this: God comes to us disguised as our life. God comes to us disguised as our life. We don't find God in spite of our circumstances or on the other side of our circumstances or acquire him in the way we want him to be or how we want him to show up. We find him in the midst of where we are. When we look at life through the lens of things being either good or bad, happy or sad, God becomes hidden in plain sight, and joy seems elusive. God comes to us disguised as our life. Paula Darcy made this beautiful observation a few years later, after her husband and daughter were killed in a drunken driving accident. She was 27 years old, 3 months pregnant. She survived unharmed. 6 months later, she gave birth to her second daughter, Beth, and began the long process of healing. God comes to us disguised as our life. I know there are many of you here that are navigating pain that I can't even understand. And all this talk of discontentment to joy seems like an impossibility. And you can't even begin to process. What are you talking about, joy? Please know that when I prepare to teach or preach, my practice is first and foremost to preach and teach to myself. Today, March 17th, is St. Patrick's Day. It's also a day that's my dad's birthday. My dad hasn't been around for 2.5 years when he was gone suddenly and unexpectedly without any warning signs. And when my dad suddenly fell ill, I was certain God was going to hear my prayers in the way I wanted him to answer them. I'm not going to explain away his death. Cancer is unjust. There's no excuse for it. I don't think it's the will of God. But what I had discovered is that God met me. In my pain and in my suffering and in my family's suffering, and met me with his gaze of love. Now, it's interesting, March 17th is his birthday. March 15th, we celebrate as a family because a small, tight-knit family on March 15th, 34 years ago, came to Canada. We immigrated. And we were always a close family, but when you immigrate and all you have is just your immediate family, you become very tight-knit. So it's a lot. March is a weird time. There's celebrating and there's sadness. But when I practice examine in the suffering, in the things that life throws at us that we just wish it didn't, we meet God's gaze. And for me, in that moments, in those prayer moments with God, where are you? My gaze saw a suffering Messiah who reminds me that in his renewal, even in the wilderness, that the resurrection is coming. And what seems like desolate wilderness, a barbaric cross, a tomb, a grave, all will be renewed into a garden of life.